welcome to the European Business Summit. We're starting the second day of a series of Facebook live sessions here from Brussels. You can join us live on euronews Facebook account, where we're having live interviews with various speakers. And please share your questions and comments just below the stream you see on your screen. You can also join us on Twitter using the hashtag EBS2017. And we're starting our second day coverage with Michael Bruta.
Hello.
Professor of Political Science and European Politics, London School of Economics.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for being here with us.
Pleasure.
We woke up this morning to the news on the attack at Manchester. Political parties have suspended general election campaigning. Could it affect the campaign in general, and in which way?
It can certainly affect the election. The first thing to know is that obviously, the country will wake up in shock. I work at the LSE, but I'm originally from Nice, so I know exactly what it feels like for the people to unfortunately face such a tragedy in their backyard. And I think that people will not be thinking about political things right away. But then in the next few days after they mourn the victims and feel sad for the country and the regions, people will inevitably be affected as well, and the campaign will be inevitably affected in a number of ways, both directly and indirectly. I mean, the direct element is that usually when there are terror attacks, it tends to strengthen extremist parties, and it tends to strengthen more right-wing political parties. The more indirect element is that such attacks usually create a bit of a break in the campaign, in part because, as you mentioned, the political parties have decided to suspend the campaigning. And that can actually modify the dynamics of the campaign. So the dynamic at the moment, what is interesting, was that the campaign is being interrupted at a time when the Conservative Party was losing a lot of its lead. So the question is whether that interruption will enable them to erase, if you want, that negative dynamic for them. We only have a couple of weeks. I don't know for how long the campaign will be interrupted exactly. It's a very strange campaign as well because, again, there is no very direct debating between the candidates, in part because the Prime Minister was keen on not having a public debate, a public TV debate with all the other leaders, as had been the case in recent elections. And as a result, there is already no direct interaction. So I think that in terms of the opposition parties, particularly Labour and the Liberal Democrats, which considered that they had finally started to reverse the tendency and gain ground against the Conservatives after a number of issues with their campaign on social benefits, the help of people suffering from dementia. Well, it could actually go back to that. It could actually go back to the issue of safety, strong leadership, which is the framing that Theresa May has tried to impose on the campaign from the start. I mean, her main argument has been, we need stability, we need a strong majority, we need strong government. And in a way, the terror attack are the sort of argument she would be using very directly to justify. Exactly, to justify that sort of suggestion.
In terms of the way the politicians will change their tone after the attack, is that correct?
Yes, well, in terms of Labour and the Liberal Democrats, things are a little bit more difficult because the way they have been, trying to influence the campaign has been by explaining that effectively the Prime Minister's plan from Brexit is not just about a hard Brexit, but about a hard Britain, if you want, about hardening social divisions by lowering social benefits, lowering taxes, risking to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. So they've been campaigning very much on issues of Brexit and issues of social balance, if you want, within society. And it will be difficult for them to actually go back to those sort of arguments when much of the country will be focused on the terror risk, which is striking again. I mean, just as a reminder to your audience, I mean, this is the most murderous attack that Britain has suffered since July 2005 and the series of London terror attacks.
We've seen serious attacks. We've seen an attack just during the campaign in France last year. How did that impact the campaign in France in the election?
Well, the French election was
It's very important that it was not like now. It was not like 2 weeks before the vote. How important is the time?
Election timing is always something very mysterious. I mean, part of the research that we do, I mean, as you mentioned, I'm a professor of political science, but my main area of specialty is what we call electoral psychology. So, in a way, what happens in the minds of voters, and in part, and in parts, the way they actually live through election and campaigns. And one of the things we find is that within a week of any vote, so just 1 week, between 20 and 30% of voters will either make up or change their minds. And half of them, so between 10 and 15%, will change their mind or make up their mind on election day itself. So the last 2 weeks are actually the most important ones. And then the closer we get to the final week, the most movement there will be in people's opinion. And this is all the more important this time because we've seen a lot of movement. As compared to what we normally see in election campaigns where there might be 1 or 2 points difference from one poll to the next. I mean, this time we've seen some successive opinion polls just a few days apart where political parties were gaining or losing 3 points, 4 points up and down. And this is, in that sense, the electorate seems to be very unsettled. So I think that context is actually more important than the timing. The fact that it is actually happening in an election campaign where everybody seems to be predicting an easy...
election campaign, but also, excuse me for interrupting,
please.
But also during the Brexit talks as well.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's the Brexit talk. I mean, in that sense, by the way, that's a bit less favorable for the Prime Minister because the Prime Minister has been suggesting in a way that Europeans needed British collaboration in terms of fighting terror. What this attack reminds us of, unfortunately, is that everybody needs cooperation. Nobody has a choice. I mean, the Brits need it just as much as the rest of the European Union need it. I mean, terror is a global phenomenon. It's not a phenomenon which anybody can fight on their own. It's also a phenomenon which, I mean, obviously there is no, at least by the time I arrived here, there was no information about, the likely suspects in last night's attack. But many of the attacks committed so far have been committed by people from the countries where they were striking. So it's very possible again that this might be an internal issue. So it's not, even though it has an impact on the debates on migration, very often those are not really migration-related questions in empirical terms.
Speaking about the voters who are changing their minds, do you think what happened in Manchester might change the way people, those who voted for Brexit, for example, could they become a little bit pro-European? Could they change their mind? Could that influence it?
I don't think, well, one of the things which has been really extraordinary about the Brexit vote is that it took place, literally 11 months ago today.
Absolutely.
And as you know, the result was about 52% who voted in favor of leaving and 48% in favor of staying. People haven't converged at all. The people who voted to leave still think that we absolutely must leave, and the people who voted to remain have not been convinced at all and still think that this is one of the most stupid decisions that the United Kingdom has taken in a long time. So the two, there is really no reconciliation, if you want, between those two parts of the electorate. Now, the big question, so I don't think this is going to make anti-European more pro-European or pro-Europeans more anti-European. The question is the extent to which attitudes towards Brexit will influence the way people vote. Now, when it comes to the people who voted to remain, I think that there is a good chance that those people will want to vote against the Conservatives, because the Conservatives have made it very clear that they want to use that election as a mandate to conduct what most people would consider a hard Brexit. When it comes to the people who voted in favor of leaving the European Union, on the other hand, this is a little bit less obvious to me. I mean, what happened in the last elections in 2015 was that, if you remember, most of the polls expected a hung parliament. They didn't expect an outright majority, which the Conservatives got. The reason why the Conservatives got a majority is because in many of the northern constituencies, which tend to traditionally favor Labour, UKIP actually performed very well. And because we have a system of what we call plurality, first past the post, the UKIP score was often enough to make Labour the second party rather than the first. Now, in the current campaign, UKIP is not expected to do very well at all. Their expected score is actually very poor. And in terms of the people who supported Brexit in those parts, more in poorer parts of the United Kingdom, my sense is that they will not necessarily vote for the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party has been economically, socially, their main enemy, if you want, for many years. So in that sense, I'm not necessarily convinced, as most of my colleagues seem to be, that there will be a Conservative landslide, because I think that in the north of England in particular, the Conservatives might not do very well.
Most of your colleagues here 1 year ago exactly at the European Business Summit were saying no, there would be no Brexit at all, you know. Most of them, because 1 year ago there was a whole debate here about we were just weeks away from the referendum here, and of course we were discussing the referendum whether it would be Brexit or not Brexit. No, there's not going to be Brexit. Most of them said there's going to be no Brexit.
Well, for the record, my team actually predicted that there would be a Brexit and that Trump would win the election in the US. So we got those two right, and we had actually predicted...
Did you get right the one the French election, right? From the first two?
Yes.
Yes?
As well, but I think that was more of a lucky guess. But Brexit, we had actually...
Well, the first two probably.
Well, but the Brexit, we had actually, we were one of the only people who actually already a year before the Brexit referendum, when David Cameron announced it, and everybody seemed to suggest that, this would actually, the people would vote to remain in the EU. We were among the first ones to say that this would come at a time when the people would want to punish the government, and therefore that there would likely be an anti-establishment vote that could actually lead to Brexit.
I would like to ask you about your research. I read about the LSE research from January 2017. I'm going to remind it quickly to our viewers that according to the research, nearly half of voters, because we're now here on referendum, felt disgust towards people who voted differently from them in the referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union. So we have 51% of those who cast a vote in the June poll had angry feelings about supporters of the opposite camp. Is that something extraordinary to have this kind of emotional?
Absolutely. I mean, you're right. Just the researcher I'm mentioning, by the way, is something that your viewers can read directly. It's an article that Sarah Harrison and myself published in Nature, Human Behavior, and which can be read online for free by everyone as part of our, ECREB team, Research in Electoral Psychology. And the one thing we really try to show is exactly that Brexit was a very emotional vote. Another finding that we mentioned, which you don't mention, is that a third of people admitted to have tears in their eyes when they discovered the results. And nearly half, 46% of young people aged 18 to 24. So that included both people who were so happy that they were, on the verge of tears, and people who were very sad and were crying or ready to cry. And the other very important element is the one you mentioned, which we think is actually extraordinary and very symptomatic, which is that for the first time that I can recall, you know how for many years now, across Europe and across most of the world, voters have started to feel very negatively towards elites and their politicians and parties and so on. So, anti-establishment, anti-elites and so on. But for the first time, they're not stopping after blaming politicians. They actually start resenting the voters, the people who vote differently from them. This is what we refer to as a phenomenon of hostility. And as you mentioned, that's a very large proportion. And actually, since we don't have those results, but we conducted a study on the forthcoming general election with our partners from Opinion. And I just got the results yesterday. And again, in the context of the Brexit referendum, we asked them again how people felt towards people who voted differently from them. And again, there is that prevalence of hostility, negativity, anger, frustration, and sometimes even disgust towards people who voted differently. This is it's very strong words. And again, what is very new is that it's not just addressed at politicians, but at fellow citizens. And that to me is very symptomatic, because it suggests that there is a real division, a real fracture within society, which could have very important implications. Because when you think of Brexit and its consequences, all the experts are predicting that Brexit will lead to economic tensions, inflation, a weakening pound, which means that everything is going to be more expensive for British people to buy when it's actually imported. And when there is inflation, the main people to be affected are, for instance, pensioners.
And we've seen with the latest inflation in April that now basically the general income is squeezing more or less if you compare to the
Exactly.
0.7 inflation in April.
That means that you are poorer as a result. And what this means, so again, the main people to be affected will be pensioners, and the main people will be affected when it comes to, the tax implications and the subsidies implication are the poorer regions which used to get subsidies from the European Union. Now, all these people will be less vulnerable, and they will be asking the government to compensate for the cost of Brexit. But of course, those people represent the constituencies that largely voted in favor of Brexit. And the people who will be asked to pay are the people who voted in favor of remaining. So the problem here is one of solidarity. What happens when you ask people who voted to remain to make more sacrifices so that the people who voted to Brexit are not disproportionately affected by the vote that effectively the situation that they created? And that will create a very complex situation in terms of political behavior, because it could break the lines of solidarity and break the lines of unity and legitimacy within the country.
We have a question from our viewers on the referendum debate in Scotland. That's another side of the issue, because in the UK nowadays it's very, the variety of these events and moves, and because your take on the referendum in Scotland?
It's very difficult to tell, because usually
Scotland voting to remain.
Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain. Large cities like London and Manchester and Glasgow voting overwhelmingly to remain, and Brighton and a few others. So there are a number of divisions and fractures. The difference is that, of course, Scotland would have technically a way out, quite literally, by deciding for independence. Now, there was a referendum in 2014, and there was a clear majority ultimately for Scotland to remain in the United Kingdom. And it becomes a bit of a gamble on the part of Nicola Sturgeon to know whether Scottish voters will effectively forgive her for considering that Brexit justifies having a new referendum. I think that this might all very well depend on.
In Scotland, they don't want to go for referendum.
Well, I think referenda.
Various polls, but not everybody supports the whole idea of the second referendum.
No, exactly. I mean, the opinion is split even on the notion of having a referendum or not. But typically, I would say it's almost a paradoxical question, because most of the people who support the idea of a new referendum are the people who would support voting for independence anyway, and most people who oppose a referendum are the people who are quite happy with the status quo anyway. But the question, I think that this will very much depend on the context at the time of the referendum, and also the way the central government handles the situation. I think part of the tension between Theresa May and Nicola Sturgeon is that I think that Nicola Sturgeon has been pushing, in a way, Theresa May into being the bad guy, if you want, in the discussion, and blocking the right of the Scottish people to hold a second referendum when and where they want. And conversely, Theresa May has been trying to avoid a referendum being held at a time when Brexit is likely to have the worst of its social and economic consequences, because I think that implicitly she realizes. We have a campaign on the principle of a referendum, the timing of a referendum, and the legitimation of the idea of a referendum.
We have Theresa May on one hand and Nicola Sturgeon on the other hand.
Exactly. And of course, part of there is a competing legitimacy between two relatively strong leaders as well. I mean, SNP has been overwhelmingly dominant in Scotland, and it has been re-elected in power with a very large number, despite a much more unfavourable electoral system than what we have in the United Kingdom, and that creates that gives Nicola Sturgeon a form of mandate. Theresa May has been hoping that if she got a big mandate in the forthcoming elections, and if the SNP lost some of its dominance in Scotland, Sturgeon's position would be weakened. But it's equally possible that Sturgeon's position might be strengthened by the result of the election, especially if the Conservative lead in the election continues to reduce over the coming days.
You said last year you and your team, you got it right with the referendum, you got it right with Donald Trump. Let's look for, I don't know, 1 year from now, 1 year ahead from now, your forecast. For
Well,
the UK as well, because we're in the middle of the Brexit talks and the election coming.
it's very difficult. I mean, you know, one of the, obviously, as I mentioned to you earlier, I think that my prediction would be personally that I don't expect, and maybe, you know, the fact that now I'm, you know, saying it to you on Euronews Live means that I will get that wrong. I mean, political scientists are notoriously bad forecasters usually, so, you know. But my personal expectation would be that the Conservatives will not get the landslide that everybody had been predicting for weeks. Now, part of the reason for it is that at the time when Brexit took place and a few months later Trump won, there was a large expectation in the UK that the sort of populist movement, if you want, radical victories, if you want to call them that way, would continue everywhere else in Europe. And when you read the tabloid press and when you listened to some of the pro-Brexit politicians, they expected Wilders to do very well in the Netherlands, Marine Le Pen to do very well in France, maybe the Austrians to elect Hofer. None of this happened. There seems to have been, you know, a counter-revolution, if you want, a counter-movement where pro-European inclusive movements have been fighting back. What I called, you know, the sort of centrist, liberal, democratic antibodies in a way, as if the voters in other European countries had been warned. What this means is, you know, if you try to go back to your student years, you know, when occasionally you might have had a frozen pizza in front of your TV, it's never very pleasant to eat frozen pizza in front of your TV, right? But if you do it and, you know, all your friends are doing the same, it's not great, but it's okay. If you're having a frozen pizza in front of your TV and you know that all your friends are partying together, then suddenly things become much more unpleasant. You feel isolated and you feel lonely. That's exactly what's the risk with Brexit. You know, when British people voted for Brexit and then Donald Trump won, Brexiters and tabloids promised the British people that everybody would be eating frozen pizza. And what the British people are starting to discover now is that maybe everyone else will be partying and the UK will be the only country eating its frozen pizza in front of the TV.
So you think we keep on partying instead of eating frozen pizza in front of TV?
I think the rest of Europe will keep partying. I think that the victory of Macron has been very decisive in France.
It's been a kind of a game changer.
I think it has been very much a game changer because, you know, again, there had been a focus on the Netherlands, there had been a focus on Austria, but France is a major European democracy and it had been largely viewed by many analysts across Europe and the Western world in general as the weak link, if you want, the danger zone in terms of populism. And Macron didn't only defeat Le Pen, he defeated Le Pen with a very openly, I mean, the clearest part of his program is that it is very pro-European. Again, remember, you know, the day when he won, he actually went to the courtyard of the Louvre and he made his entrance on the Ode to Joy, the European anthem. The next day he actually flew to Berlin, met Angela Merkel. A few days later he went to Africa. I mean, traditionally African policy in France is a very French policy. He spent half of his speech referring to European collaboration and the fact that Europeans needed to have a common policy on Africa. So it is really trying to propose renovation, change from a Europeanized point of view. And I think that with Macron's victory, the likely, you know, renewed strength of both the CDU and the SPD in the German elections and what the current lead of moderate parties in Italy as well, I think that there might be a decision by core European countries to renew European integration and renew, or reinvent, if you want, the European project.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Marco Rita, Professor of Political Science and European Politics, London School of Economics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.